is I'm just going to clean up what's visible there. Sorry, I'm just going to clean up the messy part of that. So if I click the mask for this, I'm just going to make a white layer, and I'm just going to hand paint in around these buildings so we don't get this splotchy error where we've adjusted things. And then I'm also just going to paint that in around the trees as well, so the trees are properly affected as well. And you can be very rough. A lot of my workmates were kind of they had no idea that you had to even do this stuff, but this is the type of stuff that makes all the difference. So just double check, just zoom in. You can see the mask has done the quick mask we've made has done a pretty good, decent job. And so now I think we can save this off as a new adjusted HDR and begin lighting the scene with it. So I'm going to call this lesson 6. Tone mapped. And I always add, in terms of naming convention, now that we're getting later into the series, when you're working with other artists, I always have my initials and then the version number. That's so if another artist comes on and starts making adjustments, say if I get to version number 15, which is very likely on some jobs that last a month or so, you don't want to load up a Photoshop file which you don't know was saved by you last. So always make sure that if you haven't started working in the industry yet, to make sure you start teaching yourself correct naming conventions. And they don't have to be complex, but you can always notice when I'm uploading files to you guys and stuff, there's a naming convention. You know, there's a start and a finish file with things versioned and labeled, and shaders are tried, like everything's tried to be a little bit clean. However, if you've ever worked with me, you know I can be very, very messy with some things. Alright, so I'm just going to save that off, and now we can render it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to select a small area so we can compare the before and after without having to go in and set up like history and previewing before and after that way. I'd like to work as quick as possible. So I'm going to load this, lesson 6 tone mapped. Sorry, that was off screen. Before we had the original Marground, I'm just going to load the tone mapped. And we're just going to re-render. So instantly you can see the effect that's had. A lot of that blue is gone now. But in the reflection, there's not really much blue. It's all pretty dull anyway in the backplate. So that should line up a little bit closer. The next thing I want to do now that I've removed the blue from the sky is I want to get the ground plane matched a little bit closer. So let me just hide this a little bit. And one thing you can do is I'm just going to hide the ground plane here. And I'm going to make a new V-Ray shader. And what I'm going to do is here's the little trick. If I go into the diffuse options box and tick the color picker, what I can do is I can sample that ground color. Now remember, when I'm sampling that color, that's not the exact color that material would be in real life, because this material is reflective and it's absorbing light from the scene. So you need to go darker, and you might need to push things a little bit more saturated, because in reality that color is going to be slightly more blue from the reflection in the sky. So you just saturate it up a little bit and go down on the darkness. And I'm just going to unhide the backplate again. And I'm just going to do another region render to see how that's affecting things. And the goal is to get this matching a little bit closer to the ground plane. Sorry, I've just got to assign that material. So there you go. The color's a lot closer now. Maybe it needs to be a little bit more yellow. So I'm just going to go in there and make that adjustment. And it's all just eyeballing. Going to make it a little bit brighter. And that's good enough for now. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to emulate the type of lighting that's bouncing back up into the shader ball. So I'm just going to do a quick render of everything, just so our eyes are not confused. And now you can see in the ground, it's getting much closer. But if you remember, we've got to do things step by step here, and you've got to kind of work in a way where things are, it's hard to put it in, working in a way where you're increasing the realism as you go, but there are a few things you need to keep in mind when you're doing that. So for example, I could very easily, without changing the intensity of the sun, think, oh, okay, everything's matching, so to get the floor correct, all I need to do is make this material brighter. And then it's going to be good, right? So if I render that and try and do it that way, you can see now that it's a bit closer to the ground, but the problem is that the shadows won't be correct. So we've increased the intensity of the ground plane, and in turn, that's going to make the shadows even brighter. And that's not what's happening in the scene. If you look behind you, you can see the shadows are actually very dark. So one law is, when we're doing this, is that you want to get the shadows right after you've got the color of the sky correct. So you want to get rid of the color cast, and then you want to balance out the sun. So I'm going to pause the video. We're going to go back into Photoshop and do some more adjustments to the HDRI file. So what we're going to do next is we're going to steal the sun from Jorgen's HDR, because you'll remember at the start of the episode I was saying that his HDRs are a lot higher quality, and if you go down, you see the sun has information all the way down to that smaller point. And it's this type of HDR that's going to give you a correct shadow and a correct lighting in the scene. Because often the biggest mistake people make is, and it's very hard to figure this out, it's very hard to teach. It wasn't only till about a year ago that I actually figured out the extent of how useful stuff like this is that when you have the sun the wrong intensity compared to the sky, all your shadows and all your lighting is out of balance. So what I found is a lot of the time you need a very high intensity sun separated off the background that you can control independently of everything else. So what I mean by that is if I zoom in here on the sun HDR, you see it's got all that nice information, and in our one, if I go down on the preview slider, it doesn't have that. Another thing it doesn't have is the correct color. Take a look at the sun here. You can see the yellow color visible in the edges. That's going to actually fill your scene with that color, as opposed to this HDR, which is a lot whiter and a lot more dull. So in the reflection here, you see the sun is kicking off kind of a very subtle, warm, orange hit. It's nearly the middle of the day, so there's not as much as in this HDR, but it is visible, and here it's not going to contribute that into the scene. And that's another reason why our floor was so blue, because the direct light hitting the surface was kind of monotone. So what I'm going to do is, and here's the importance of being able to zoom in all the way down. If you don't do that, you might want to steal all this information. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go all the way down, and you can see exactly where that most important information is. I'm going to set a feathering enabled. I'm going to set that to 25 pixels. And what that will do is when I steal the sun, it'll give it a nice soft edge automatically created around the sun. So I'm going to drag that into this scene, and you can see it's created it over here. And we've got a nice kind of soft fall off around the edge of it. Now one problem is I've got this set to normal, but if I set it to linear dodge, I'm adding the information from this HDR into this HDR, and now all of a sudden those pixels, you see here, they've got a hugely intense value, but at the same time they're only a few pixels big. So you got to imagine if you had a V-Ray light in the scene and it was tiny, it was only like, let's just say I make one. The HDR was like 0.1 by 0.1 centimeters big, maybe even smaller, maybe 0.05. The intensity of this light, in order to affect the scene, because of the surface area, it's going to need to be very, very bright. So let me set this up to, let me just copy the value here that it's saying. At the moment, that's got a value of like 292,000 pixels. 292,000, sorry, on those very center pixels. Now that's probably a bit strong because I'm adding that over the top of the other HDR. So if I minimize that down to say like 70% or something, and now measure it, it's about 88,000. So in V-Ray here, if I set the multiplier, I'll just start out with 50,000. And I'm going to turn off the HDR, just so that's the only thing affecting the lighting in our scene. And I'm just going to render it. Now I'm just guesstimating the size of that light, so let's just say I make it 2 centimeters, which is going to increase the brightness. All of a sudden you can see that that small light needs a value of 50,000 to contribute a similar amount of light to what a sun would be pushing into the scene. You get very small shadows because the light source is so small. So a good way of guesstimating how bright things can be is, how big your light needs to be, is to create a small light in the scene like that, judge the size of the shadows in your backplate, and then adjust accordingly. But because that's just guesstimating, I'm just going to delete that light, and that's just to show you that this multiplier value directly corresponds to the pixel intensity in Photoshop. Imagine that's your light multiplier. It's something that not a lot of people like fully get. But I originally thought that the V-Ray sun had an intensity of kind of like 30, but it doesn't. It's a huge number to input that much light from that smaller light source. So I'm just going to delete that light and go back to turning the HDR on. Now one thing I've got to do is because this is such a small light source now compared to the real HDR, I need to blur it a little bit. And what blurring it's going to do is it's going to make a softer shadow. So if I blur it, say to be like 2 pixels, what that's doing is it's going to make the light source bigger, the shadows are going to go softer, but also the intensity of that light is going to be reduced. So because the intensity of the light's reduced, I'm just going to go all the way up to 100 just to see if this is working in our scene. And you'll notice now when I go back up, you can't even tell the difference at the normal exposure value. So it's impossible to tell because my monitor is showing that it's just 255 wide. So that's what the importance of making all the adjustments at the correct exposure range. When I want to adjust the ground here, I'm going to adjust it so that that's all toned correctly. So let me save off this HDR. And re-render. And what you'll notice happens is that the ground becomes a lot more lit now. We've got a much more accurate representation of what's actually happening. So on the ground, you've got to imagine this paint on the floor. This backplate's not showing that as fully white. There's still a little bit of tone in that color. So what that means is, and the importance of this shader ball and why I've set certain things up certain ways is that I can go in now and I can sample the color value on the top of this ball, which let's just say has a very similar kind of, let me just go in on the ball. And a good little starting point here is we just kind of guesstimate the value of that paint, and it's going to be a little bit above gray, but kind of somewhere around here. And if I re-render this region, you'll notice that the final color output of those pixels on the top there is 1.357. Yet compared to the floor paint, which is what we're kind of trying to simulate to get the right color intensity of the sun, we want to get this value just under 1. So to do that, we need to go into here, into the Photoshop again, and minimize that light. So if I say set that to 70% and resave off that HDR file, what we'll see happen is that those pixels become softer and the lighting in the scene becomes slightly darker. And now those values on those pixels are smaller, but probably still a bit strong. So I can go down just a little bit more. But also I'm noticing that the shadows might still be a little bit hard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back down to where I can preview that light, and I'm just going to blur it just a little bit more. I'm just going to put a 1 pixel blur on it, which is once again distributing that color over a larger surface area and reducing the intensity of each pixel. Supposedly V-Ray doesn't need to have this reload button clicked every time now. However, I don't really trust that all the time. Sometimes I'll do a render and it doesn't fully update. So just by habit, I click reload. I'm happy for you guys to not do that. So now we're at about 1.12. Now the only problem is we don't know if the material here is fully matched. So just quickly, I'm going to make this slightly blurry to spread that highlight, and I'm just going to see again what happens. And the values stay roughly the same, but that's just going to spread that out. So the material's a bit closer to the floor paint. So what I want to do now is because I've got this sun in and I'm starting to have to reduce that quite a lot, I want to keep that intensity in that small point the same, but reduce the intensity everywhere else in the sky. So I'm going to hit Control and select the sky and put an exposure adjustment on, and I'm just going to drop it down a little bit. So I'm going to go -5, -0.5, and just save that. And now we've gone down too far. So I need to go to -0.25 and re-render. And hopefully this gets us just a little bit closer. You can see those values are about 0.93 now. So we're still getting areas that blow out above 1, but on perfectly flat areas like here, we're getting a value a little bit closer to what's happening on the floor. And that's going to tell us that our scene is a bit more tightly matched. So now knowing that this little material is matched closer, what I can do is I can go on the ground plane and start to adjust that again. Because I know that the intensity of the sun is a lot more closely matched. I'm just going to grab a larger surface area so I've got a bigger area to compare here. more color in. You just play with those values, get a bit more red into it. Now it's a bit too bright. So you can see, you just refine it bit by bit. And you'll remember, maybe not, at the start of the series, I was saying how I just do tiny region renders and make adjustments that way until I'm happy with my final result. So you can see what I mean here. I don't need to render the whole thing. All I need to do is see a few buckets, make the change, and then go back. And now you'll notice that it's matching a lot closer. So that's starting, that red value is 0.8. How about red value is 0.7? The green value is 0.8, and ours is 0.7. So what I can do is I can go a little bit more towards green, just like that. Just going to match the intensity, 0.7 roughly. 0.7, so the intensity is about the same. And now you can see the ground is very, very closely matched to the environment. And what that means is we'll get the correct amount of fill bouncing up into the shader ball. So I'm going to make this back to 1.0 glossiness and render the whole ball. And you'll notice now it's very hard to tell the difference between our ground plane reflecting and the road reflecting. It's very hard, which means we're getting a lot closer to matching things. The shadows now look a lot similar in color. We're still getting softness on the areas further away. Now remember, these trees are much higher up in the scene, so their shadow area is cast over a larger area, creating that effect of softness. Whereas on the light post at the back, where it's much closer to the ground, it's much harder. So we're getting that effect being matched too. The further away the shadows are from the object, the more they start to blur. So now that we've got that ground plane matched, I'm going to go into the V-Ray properties of the object, make it a matte object. I'm going to set the alpha contribution to -1, and I'm going to tick shadows and effect alpha. This will effectively reflect the object into the scene. It'll only pick up the shadows from that object, and it'll make the object itself disappear. That's how you correctly set that up. So if you have a car in the scene, you'd set it up like this. Now you see that we're rendering and the shadows remain there. And the ball looks pretty tightly matched. And it's starting to look very, very well balanced in the scene, only making a couple of adjustments. So I'm going to pause the video here, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go in and adjust the ground to be a little bit more contrasty. Because usually in HDRs you lose a little bit of that when you're shooting them. So like I was saying, now we need to make some adjustments to the ground and get the color and the intensity matched there too. Even though you don't see it that visible, you'll see in the corner here we're not matching up exactly. The color's off a little bit. So our HDR is just a bit too saturated. So what we can do is we can go into our HDR, we can select the sky, hit Control Shift and I to invert it, put another hue and saturation on, which is going to control the ground, and we get the color right on the ground. We're trying to match this color to this color. So just play with that. You can see if I just go up on the hue a little bit, you can maybe go up on the saturation just a bit there, and we can match it. So subtle things like that, you might not notice it, But if a retoucher has to go do that, every single render you give them, it slows the whole process down, and it prevents the job from sometimes going on further, because you might have a car that's had so much work put into it, and it's something very simple like floor color or sky color that's ruining the whole job. Now, this whole course I've been saying, it's just all these little things that add up. All the little details you add to the shader, all the little details you add to the HDR, all the calibrations you make to the intensity of the lighting, they all contribute to the realism. And you need to kind of unify all those things on every single job to get a fully photorealistic render. So now that I've got the hue right on the ground, I'm just going to go in and adjust the exposure. Now, one thing you can do is, you'll notice in the back plate here, we've got a little bit more contrast, whereas ours is a bit brighter and it's not as matched. So what I can do is I can introduce that by going a bit lower on the gamma correction. You see, if I do that fully, what that's doing is it's giving a little bit more pop in the image. And now on the trees, if I zoom in here, the trees match more closely too. So here the trees are a bit bright. You can see that they don't have, in the shadowy areas, that kind of darkness. So you've seen here, you're getting in the trees that correct exposure. So if we turn that on, now all of a sudden our trees are matching as well, and the intensity will more closely match. So what I want to do is I want to get my Wacom pen, which has disappeared from my desk, go into that, and just make sure that I'm painting that adjustment into the trees as well. So with a soft brush, I'm making sure I don't affect the outside, because then I'm affecting the sky and that's going to affect other things. But I'm just going to paint that in so I'm not missing anywhere. Just want to zoom in and make sure that it's affecting all the other trees in the scene. By the way, hitting F will load the different views, so sometimes I'll just go to a full screen mode to see what's happening, just to get a better idea of everything that's going on. And often I'll compare things kind of zoomed in, because you've got a better idea. So now on the floor, I can just go in and adjust the saturation just a little bit more. I'm going to take a little bit overall out to match these values a bit more closely. But then what that's done is it's probably taken a little bit of saturation out of the trees themselves. So I'm going to go into the greens, and you see I can play with the intensity of those. I'm just going to bump the intensity up just a little bit. Just going to go into the kind of yellows as well, and just bump that up just a little bit. Okay, now I'm just going to group everything so you can see the overall adjustment this has made to the HDR. So it's a pretty subtle adjustment, but it's going to make a big difference to the realism. If I go down here, you can see everything just becomes a little bit more popped, a little bit more contrasty. The colors are matched more closely. And I'm just going to save that HDR off. And re-render. And I'm just going to do a full render. There'll be a little bit more detail now in these buildings being reflected too, as well as the trees. You'll see more green being reflected in them. So on a personal job or a professional job, this is getting to the point now where it's very, very close. You can almost, this would be the point where I add in the car, start working on some shaders. But before I do that, there's a couple of last little minor touch-ups you can do. One of those is projecting the backplate onto the ground plane so that if, for example, you have a more highly reflective car paint, here it's a little less visible. Let's just say I go up on the reflection and re-render. What's going to happen is I'm reflecting this empty ground plane into the ball. So even though we've matched the color and intensity of the ground plane, we're losing all the details from the backplate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the diffuse color. Then I'm going to, remember, I'm trying to do things on a real job as fast as possible. So I think a couple of steps ahead. So you copy the diffuse color, you make a composite map. Sorry, it's just auto-saving. Make a new layer, go into here, on the base, make it a V-Ray color, paste that value in, and then on top of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a camera map per pixel. What this will do is it gives me the ability to camera project the backplate onto the ground plane here. So I'm going to go into the other viewport, I'm going to click camera and select our camera. I'm going to select the texture, which will be the backplate. You can leave it as an instance. And one more thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go out of the material now. I'm going to set that to average. So you can see the difference by turning it on and off. Now I have a little bit more information blended into the texture. I'm going to go into the maps, and in the opacity, I'm going to put a gradient. I'm going to make it radial, and I'm going to set the inside of that gradient to white. Now this will fade towards the edges. But now down here, we'll still be getting the correct intensity. So you can change the position of that color to be a little bit more open, and that'll just give you a little bit more information near the center. But now the map will fade towards the HDR, and you'll get a nicer blend around those edges. And it's just, once again, little subtle things like that people don't think about that give you a little bit more of a realistic edge. So remember, I haven't test rendered this yet, so by averaging that in, I'm just going to see if it's affecting things. I'm going to re-render. Now you get the texture being projected through. And you can see in the ground here, it's going to reflect. But I think it's done something wrong because it's set to screen mode. I wouldn't usually do it that way, I was just testing it. So in the texture here, I'm just going to go in the camera projection texture, sorry. I'm just going to load it up again as a bitmap, just so it's a texture and not an environment. Oh, it's instanced it, so that's bad. I'm just going to delete that and load it up again. And now it should work a little bit more correctly. And you can see we get the projection blending in with the real HDR. And because we've lined up the angle of the texture and other things like that, it's just matching a little bit more closely. But that ball's way too reflective. So I'm going to reduce the reflection on that, go in and analyze the color on this texture. put on this texture here, I can put a color correction. And I'm just going to saturate it up a little bit. And make it a little bit more red to match. And then we can try again. Now it's much harder to tell where that's blending. But I'm just going to cancel that on the opacity. I wouldn't usually change that to be so far out. So I'm going to reduce that to 0.4 and then do a full render again. And you can see that blend happening there. So that blend is just big enough to catch the shadow. So you get a nice blend around the edges here. It's very hard to tell. The colors are all matching up. We've got the right sky color happening. You've got a nice ping from the sun catching. And there you go. I'm going to turn on bloom and glare again and we can re-render. But one last thing I'm going to try, it might not necessarily work for this scene, is it's a little trick you can do to ground your objects more. And if you notice here at the base of the shader ball, we're kind of looking a little bit like it's floating just a bit. So one thing you can do is you can add a light above the scene in the HDR that pushes a bit more downwards shadowing. So in Photoshop, what I can do is, and remember this is a spherical HDR, so if I make a rectangle up the top here, make a new layer and fill it with a value of, say, so you can see the rough value there, what's happening. Fill it with a kind of white sun or a white surface. Just going to sample that color. It's only at 46, so I'm just going to go up on the exposure. That's 93. I'm just going to blur it a little bit. I'm going to save this off. It doesn't always work, so I'm just going to say this is 02. And go into the HDR and load the new version 2. And we'll just do another side-by-side comparison. What this will do is it's adding more light directly above the surface. For some reason it's ruined my old render, I think because I turned bloom and glare on. And yeah, I think it's just a little bit too much on this scene. So what I'll just do is, I'll just go in, reduce the opacity effectively. And just blur it a little bit more. and it's once again too small. You can see it being visible there. So I'm just going to grab it and blur it out once again, just softening that off. And now around this edge here, we're just catching a little bit more light. And over the surface itself. What that does is it just gives you a little bit more rounding on the object. So I'm going to cancel this. I'm going to increase the settings on the scene now. You can see if I go down to the color threshold, it's at 0.02. Just going down to 0.01. Everything else seems fine. And render it off. And this should be the last render. And at this point, this is where I would start bringing in some different car paint shaders and things like that. Obviously, because I've done this for a tutorial, it's taken kind of in screen recording time like an hour and a half. But if you get efficient at this, you can cut this time down anywhere between 5 minutes to half an hour and just bang things out just really quick. Just play with the bloom settings if you want. So there you have it. That's the final render, and it's sitting in there completely realistically. All the lighting's matched. You've got correct balance between the sky, the floor. You're getting more detail out of the HDR, and all those things. You can see how using this process, it's kind of irrelevant what HDR you have if you stick to that certain workflow. Otherwise, it'd just be like it'd be too hard to figure out every time. So that's why I've developed this workflow, and I know other studios do similar stuff to this. I'm not sure if they spend more time or less time on it, but I do know that the 3 studios I've worked at have all benefited hugely from this workflow. So once again, in Photoshop, that's the difference. And as you can see, it's not that big, but if I go in now and render the original, let me just load up the original HDRI. And we'll just see how that comes out. You can see the shadows are completely wrong. everything's too blue. It has that kind of fake CG look to it because of the blueness. And you can just tell it's just not sitting. So in my opinion, this is probably the most important lesson in the entire Mastering V-Ray series, because once everyone gets a hold of how to optimize scenes and stuff, that's kind of very easy to follow and kind of everyone learns that. Whereas this, no matter how many times I teach you, you'll have to practice that because it requires a really good eye at determining the difference between colors and like lighting balance. So there you go, that's the importance of it. And I've really tried to kind of, after lesson 5, which I know didn't really let down a couple of you guys, but like it wasn't as in-depth in terms of knowledge, so I wanted to come back strong and make the best video yet. So I hope this has answered quite a few questions for you guys and really like pushes your work to the next level. Because as you can see, without doing that work to the HDR, I could sit here for 2 months adjusting shaders and it still just would never look realistic. So what happens is, and what I've seen happen is, and I was explaining that at the start of the video, say you render off this, you just load the HDR, screw it, doesn't matter, you render this off, now all of a sudden the retoucher has to go in and do all that work I did to the HDR on the render. And then if a client decides to change the camera, client decides to use a different scene, they've got to go in and redo all that work. Every test render, all the steps down the line need to be redone. So this hopefully is an eye-opener for a lot of you guys. Thanks heaps. I'll try and have the next lesson out next month, early next month. And we're halfway through the course now. I think originally I was going to have between 10 to 12 lessons. I didn't intend on having multiple parts in the lessons, but we're about halfway through now. So as we get more and more into the course, I'm going to cover more and more advanced things that require you to rewatch the videos more and more. And we're going to kind of narrow down little tricks and techniques I use to get jobs looking better. And hopefully you guys are all happy with how the course is progressing. I've got the material release coming out tonight. I've just got to polish up a couple more of those and then I'll send it out to you guys. If you've got any requests for materials, please send them to my email, or if you've got any other kind of requests, just let me know. But thanks heaps guys. I'm really looking forward to the next lesson. I've got an idea of what I'm going to do for it, but I haven't fully planned it yet.